I'd like to say hello to everyone. Good afternoon. We're very happy to have you all here with us for this session. You're going to be learning a lot from Nancy Lake. Nancy Lake has been a teacher. She has taught all levels, all groups of students, all age groups. She is still in the classroom, but for the last 30 years, she has also been a teacher trainer, a wonderful teacher trainer. So I hope you enjoy the session today and you learn a lot from her. I'm gonna ask you to keep your microphones off just because of sound interference, okay? So other people can hear it well. And whatever questions you have, you may type them in the chat, okay? When Nancy finishes her presentation, she'll dedicate some time to answer all of your questions and comments, all right? Nancy, the floor is yours.
Okay, so it's nice to see all your smiling faces. Some of you have turned your cameras off. Turn them back on and give us all a big smile. One more smile before we get started. We're going to have a lovely afternoon together. Yeah, it's good to see all of you. Good, good, good. Okay, and it's a lovely warm afternoon. I have to apologize for the airplanes because some of the airplanes might be flying over. They were very quiet during the pandemic, but they started back. So it's really, I'm apologize in advance for that. But I'd like to start our afternoon. We've got 2 sessions together, and I'd like to start our afternoon actually beginning with a reflection, because basically what we're going to be talking about is our own practice. And can you all see that okay? Yes? All right. So I'm going to ask you to think about how we approach communication first. And in order to do that, we're going to take a look at communication in general, okay? We're going to approach it in how to approach it in the classroom. And I'm going to take us through 4 different steps, basically, in order to talk about this with you this afternoon. So the first one is some considerations about communication in general. And then the second one is going to be thinking a little bit about a communication overview and what it is and what it is like to teach communication, because there are some things we need to take into consideration when we talk about teaching communication. And then we're going to look at the methodology of a communicative methodology and think of actually how that can help us to teach communication and how to prepare our classes, thinking about that. So we've got a 4-step first afternoon to start out with. And once again, I invite you to write your questions in the chat or bring them up at the end. So to start out, I'd like to show you a little video about how to define communication. Rather than asking you to put your ideas about what communication is, I'm going to share with you a very interesting video that takes into consideration both spoken and a little bit of written communication in our day-to-day life. And there are 3 things that I want you to try to find in terms of elements of communication. So when you hear them, they are transmission, interpretation, and the exchange of information. And what ties all of these together? So let's watch the video.
What is communication? We use it every day, but can we specify or define what it is? We define communication as the transmission, interpretation, and exchange of information. Now, if there's an exchange, it means that there's more than one party involved. Typically, these parties are 2 human beings, and a classic example to describe a communication is an eye-to-eye conversation. You know how it used to be. Back in the day, when we sat around a bonfire telling our buddy how we spectacularly chased down that saber-toothed tiger to feed the kids in the cave. But even before, when spoken language was not yet developed, we knew how to communicate. Just imagine the cavemen painting their experiences on the cave wall. So clearly, we can communicate verbally and non-verbally. But since we now live in the 21st century and globally connected companies as well as high-tech machines are part of our everyday lives, there's more to say about communication. According to our definition, that a communication consists of the transmission, interpretation and exchange of information. then how we interact with our computers might just be a communication as well. Well, of course, as of now, the conversation with the computer is just not that, let's say, vivid. The mechanics, however, are similar. You push a button on your keyboard and the computer perceives, interprets and reacts. So what do you think about this? Do you consider the interaction with a computer or even a company a communication? Let me know in the comments or personal message. Let's communicate!
Okay. So we talked about three things. He talked about three things, but the most important thing is the exchange of information. And he said it involves the transmission and interpretation and the exchange of information. So the most important thing for us to keep in mind is that communication is social. Communication is social. It involves more than one person. It involves the exchange of information, and it's being able to transmit that information and interpret it. That is the element of communication.
Excuse me,
What
Nancy.
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides anymore. Can you share them again?
I stopped sharing.
Okay, that's all right. I thought you wanted us to say something.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to go back to the slides and ask you questions and ask you to think about 4 things in terms of what is it that we facilitate in communication. Okay, so when we go back, this is what I'm going to ask you to look at. And I'm going to ask you to give me a thumbs up, okay, if you think this is important to communication. If we take into consideration then that teaching communication emphasizes interaction, it also focuses on the teacher being a facilitator. So my questions are, give me a thumbs up, if you facilitate this kind of communication. Do your learners like to communicate about series? That they're watching on TV? Let me see. Let me see. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Okay. The next question. The next question. Do your learners like to communicate about games they're playing or games they're watching? Thumbs up if they do. Okay. Yeah, quite a few people. Let me take a look at the other group. Lots of thumbs up. Okay. Next question of our mini survey. Do your learners like to communicate about what their friends are doing? Two thumbs up, okay, right. And the last one is, do they like to communicate about gossip in general? Yes, thumbs up. Okay. All right, quite a few. So this is really interesting. So this is what I'm proposing, that our learners like to communicate about this. This is what we have to facilitate. So we need to find moments in our materials, in our daily practice, to train them to communicate about talking about the series that they like, talking about the games that they like to play, or the games that they actually watch others playing. This was interesting when I discovered this with my own learners, and what their friends are doing, and of course, gossip in general. So this is what we have to facilitate. So we have to find that as real communication and recognize it. The goal then of a communicative approach is to develop fluency in language use. But we talk about fluency, we think fluency is something that flows. But fluency is really the natural language that occurs when a speaker engages in meaningful interaction. When we have meaning in the interaction, if we like talking about series, if we like talking about games, if we like talking on the phone and about what our friends are doing, and if we like gossiping in general, that is going to be meaningful interaction, and it's going to foment fluency in general. So this is one of the things that we need to think about. How do we develop fluency? Well, one of the ways we can do that is to respect what goes on when exchanging information. When we exchange information, we have to interpret it and negotiate the meaning. In order to do that, sometimes we have to use communication strategies. So you say, well, what communication strategies can I teach? Well, for example, a communication strategy is asking for clarification. Can you repeat that? Can you spell that? Can you say that again? Are examples of communication strategies. Just as when you're satisfied, when you've interpreted and understood the message, then you can say things like, oh, really? Wow, that's interesting. Or something simpler like, that's nice, okay? So this is one of the things students must be given opportunities to do if they are going to learn communication. They need to be able to negotiate meaning, need to be able to use communication strategies, and they need to be able to correct misunderstandings. So you think, well, what's an example of that? For example, I'm talking about a friend of mine at home, and I say, I'm trying to guess who you're talking about. Is he talking on the phone? Oh, he's talking on the phone. No, he isn't. Is he sleeping? No, he isn't. So what's he doing? So you need to correct misunderstandings. If I want to know what he's really doing, I need to be able to get around that. And we need to work to avoid communication breakdowns. I want to know what my friend is doing. I want to talk to my friend. I want to be able to set something up with my friend. But if I can't ask for information about what he's doing, the communication breaks down. So this is one of the things that we need to take care that happens in our classroom. So, but we're teachers and we're concerned about not only having fluency, but also having accuracy. So one of the big things that we need to take care of in all the senses of the word is making fluence practicing meaningful. Accuracy as teachers is something that we really want to work on because we want to give them the correct examples for language use. And we're constantly thinking of, we're correcting our students, we're creating activities, practice activities that are controlled activities. So let's analyze a little bit about this delicate balance between fluency and accuracy. The characteristics then of accuracy activities are pretty recognizable because they're in all of our textbooks. They're things that we can use in the classroom. They're language that we practice in the classroom so that outside of the classroom it can be useful, but we use it in the classroom. Accuracy activities focus on the formation of correct examples of language. This is like saying the right form, the right meaning, but also the right structure. And sometimes accuracy activities then are practices that are outside of the real context of language, just because we really want them to control. An example of this is when we ask our students to repeat something, and we just ask them to repeat it mechanically because they need to get their mouth parts around it. So sometimes this is what we consider an accuracy activity. I want my students to be able to pronounce watched, baked, asked correctly. So I'm going to give them a chance to say this, but maybe I will have just some really out of context practice just by repetition. Another characteristic of accuracy activities is that we really focus on small samples of language. We don't have huge conversations, but rather we practice small things like answering yes/no questions or answering a very simple WH question just for practice of language without a context. So some of our accuracy activities may not require meaningful communication. For sure, there's always a control, a limited amount of choice in terms of the language that the learners are going to be working with when we talk about accuracy activities. But that doesn't make them the big bad wolf. That doesn't make them a no-no in the classroom. What makes accuracy important is if it is aiming towards fluency. So you say, well, Nancy, how how are we going to aim towards fluency? What are the types of activities then that are fluency based? Well, they are activities that first reflect the natural use of language. So our communication strategies are very important here. Oh, really is a good one. Also, they are usually focusing on achieving some kind of communication. I want to know what my friend is doing. So I'm going to ask one person, another person, another person until I find out what he's really doing. So this is more of a fluency activity. Characteristics of fluency activities involve the use of meaningful language. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what meaningful language is in a couple of minutes, but they require meaningful use of language. An example would be if I want to speculate about something. Oh, she must be 12 years old. She can't be 15. Okay? I'm using modals to speculate, but I'm talking about a real use of describing a picture of a young girl. They also require the use of communication strategies, asking for clarification, asking for repetition, asking for spelling so that we can understand something better, or just commenting, that's interesting, that's nice, to make the communication more natural and sound more fluent. A good example of this is when you ask someone for, you want some personal information. You usually start out by saying, oh, can you give me your full name, please? And I'll need your address is much more meaningful than just saying, what's your name, what's your address? So when we try to think about how we can contextualize our activities, we need to think about how meaningful the language that our learners are going to be using actually is. And they should ultimately, fluency activities, produce language that might not be predictable. Something, for example, when you ask your students to practice what they're doing on their vacation, they might say something that you couldn't predict, like maybe they're taking a course, maybe they're going to summer school at their school, but this might not be part of a textbook language. So it goes beyond the classroom and into something that is their real life. And the most important thing is that fluency activities link to context. Language is always learned in a social context, so we need to clarify what the context is in our learners' practice so that it makes it more meaningful for them to use the language that they're using. So the question here is, how do we balance the delicate accuracy fluency dichotomy in our classrooms? The key is to think about meaningful practice. Meaningful practice involves making meaningful choices and practicing, even though the language control is still provided. There's not a lot of language. It involves really and truly making meaningful choices. So, for example, if you have an activity in which you're looking at a picture and people are doing things on the beach, you should be able to choose any one of the people in the scenario and talk about them and be able to say what they're doing so that you can describe a picture. This is meaningful practice. If you show just a simple visual of a person taking a shower or going for a walk or listening to music, it becomes much more meaningful if it is shown as a whole picture. The learner chooses which ones he wants to speak about and has the competency and the language that he needs to actually do that. Communicative practice, then, if we talked about meaningful practice, we mentioned here meaningful practice where there is some control. But when we talk about communicative practice, these are larger. These are activities where practice is using language within a real communicative context, where real information is exchanged, where we have real information about series, talking about series they're watching on Netflix, where we have real information where they're talking about games, real information where they're talking about their friends or talking on the phone, real information in which they're talking or gossiping in general, because it ultimately enables speakers to exchange information correctly and understand what the others are transmitting so that everything can be interpreted, understood, and exchanged communicatively. These are the things we need to take into consideration when we're talking about fluency and accuracy. So let's take a look and see how this particular practice is communicative. First of all, it is communicative because it is a game. And at this age, at any age, whether you're an adult or a child, it's really, really important to be able to play games. We love having fun is important, and games challenge us. And anytime the brain is challenged, it's going to pay more attention and be more engaged in the learning process. Because basically, it is the brain that does the learning. So we take into our brain, we take new information in. It is filtered through the amygdala and placed into the cortex, ultimately when it is connected to other language that has been learned. So here we have something that is communicative. It's a real context. Our learners live either in apartment buildings or in houses. But certainly, even for those who live in houses, an apartment building is a real context. We have real students. We have James, Matt, and Ava. We have Josh, Hannah. We have Jake, Sophia, Ella, Haley, Addison, Logan, and Ryan. We have 12 people, 12 teens living in a building. And I know all of them. So this is a real context. I know all of the people who live in this building. It's real in that we can imagine, even if we don't always know everybody, we know quite a few people and we might want to gossip about them and find out what they're doing. And so I'm thinking about one of them, and your task is to guess which one I'm thinking about. So it is communicative in that we're always guessing what the other speaker is going to be talking about. And this is really interesting to our learners. So we have this kind of a game. And the first thing they need to be able to do is choose someone they're thinking about. Okay? So in the example, I'm thinking about Jake, and he's reading a book. But I have to give you some kind of a clue to help you guess. So the first thing I say is, he's not sleeping. So it's communicative in the sense that I'm giving you information and you need to interpret it. He's not sleeping. So that means he's not Josh. I look there and I say, he's not Josh. So I guess somebody else. And since I like soccer, I'm going to say Ryan. Okay. And then the other person says, no, he's not playing soccer. So I know that it's not Logan, it's not Ryan. I know that it's not Josh. I have to choose between the other three boys, right? James, Matt, and Jake, because James and Matt are reading and Jake is reading. So then I say, I guess Jake, just like I would in a real communicative activity. Right, he's reading a book, okay? Because James and Matt are reading the same book or studying together. So this kind of a challenge is truly a communicative practice. It talks about friends, it proposes a challenge, it engages the learners, it makes them think, and it involves the act of communication, of transmitting, interpreting, and exchanging information. So this is one of these things that we have in our textbooks, but sometimes we look at it as, oh, well, this is just another practice. But if we take another look at it, if we look at it through communication eyes, we will see that there are lots of things that need to be respected in order to be able to make this come across as useful, meaningful language. Otherwise, it's not going to be truly communicative. And that's our task as teachers. So we need to think of, first of all, of a methodology that can help us look at this as communication. And then we need to think about how to transmit them the necessary information that they need, how to teach what they need to learn in order to be able to perform this communicative task. And then finally, how to prepare for this. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few slides. And this is what a communicative methodology proposes to do. A communicative methodology has changed teaching to something which we call communicative language teaching or communication language teaching. But it has changed a lot since it first came into being in the 90s. And I'm going to show you 10 assumptions about current communicative methodology that will help us look at that kind of an activity that we saw in the previous slide and interpret it in terms of communication and prepare to teach it and actually teach it in the classroom. So the first assumption is that second language learning is facilitated when learners are engaged in interaction and meaningful communication. We've already said that meaningful communication then is something you would use in real life, and it's going to be interactive, it's going to be social. And effective classroom learning tasks and exercises provide opportunities for students to negotiate meaning, like we did in our activity before, expand language resources, meaning learn more language, notice how the language is used, so we have to pay attention to some things, and take part in meaningful interpersonal exchanges. So these two assumptions then are very basic to a communicative methodology. So if we're going to present language effectively and engage language, we need to contextualize. We need to tell them, think about a building. Imagine you are in an apartment building, or imagine you're thinking about some people in an apartment building. What questions can you elicit from them? What questions can you ask about the people in the building? So some students will say things like, what's his name? Where does he live? What floor does he live on? Fine, but the idea is to involve the learners through careful questioning, engaging them in the context, okay? So 12 people who live in a building, and I'm thinking of one of them. So let's think about some questions we can ask about the activities that they're doing. But you need to scaffold tasks so that they are doable. So if you think of a scaffold, the way we scaffold tasks is we break them down into smaller parts and work on them separately for success. So one of the things of the parts of that particular communicative activity that I showed you is I need to be able to ask about what people are doing. I need to know the vocabulary that is involved in their activities. I need to know how to say those words in English, okay? I need to be able to say whether the person is right or wrong in their guesses. And I need to be able to understand what the other person is saying. So I need to be able to listen to what they're saying, interpret the information, and then tell them whether they're right or wrong. So there are 4 or 5 little tasks that are involved in being able to participate in that one communicative activity. So scaffolding then presents the language gradually. Let's work a little bit here on the vocabulary. Let's work a little bit here on asking questions about what people are doing. Let's talk a little bit here about how I can say whether you're right or wrong, and getting clarification. Am I right? Did I say it right? And then we can give encouragement during all the phases. As we build the communicative activity, we can actually scaffold the language for the future speaking tasks that they're going to be having. But our challenge is tremendous because unlike other subject matters in their schools, we use communication to teach communication. So we use English to teach English. When they learn math, they use Portuguese, the teacher uses Portuguese to teach math. When they work with history, they use Portuguese to teach history. But we cannot use Portuguese to teach English unless it is in a specific moment when we can't go any further. But to talk about the language rather than to actually use the language to teach the language is going to be frustrating for our learners, is not going to give them the communicative competence that they need and want, and ultimately will close off the challenge and engagement of real learning, of real communication. So we need to think about how we're going to scaffold. We need to think about how we're going to organize things and use language to teach language. And we can do that if we're careful about the questions we choose, about how we get them to notice things, about how we personalize. Because as soon as we personalize with our students, we are engaging them. Oops, sorry. So we have a sample here of how we can use scaffolding. Supposing we want to talk to someone on the phone, we start out by actually working with talking to each other. So talking on the phone is one of the things that our real teens like to do. But we can start out by saying, just what about you? What are you doing? And think about, first of all, the vocabulary that we had. So we saw they were jogging, we saw they were listening to music, they were reading, they were studying, they were playing soccer, they were talking on the phone. We can connect this, we can link this talking on the phone to one of the practices we can use to scaffold. So for example, we teach our students to greet each other, say what they're doing, just practicing the vocabulary in a very simple exchange. So this is contextualized. We contextualize with a picture. We practice just a part of the conversation that they might need to be able to then ultimately talk about other people and what they're doing. The third and fourth assumption talks about how students learn. It's that meaningful communication then results from students processing content that is relevant, purposeful, interesting, and engaging. And especially at this age, it has to be interesting and engaging. And so it often means that we're going to have to use another source of language to another skill to be able to help them scaffold the things that they need to learn for the ultimate communicative goal. So for example, we have here this kind of an activity which does this. So learners, first of all, need to be able to talk about, first they talked about themselves on the phone. What are you doing? I'm doing this. Hello, what are you doing? In a meaningful, contextualized context. The next thing we're going to scaffold is how others are doing this. If we want them to be able to ask about what their friend, guess what their friends are doing in a communicative activity, we're going to have to be sure that they understand how we talk about other people. So if we're going to engage our learners here, we have to think about some of the things that they might like to do. They might like to talk, they might like to drink something, they might like to listen to music, they might like to play a game, okay? They might need to study, and they might need to take a shower, okay? This is something that they might need to do. So here we have a context. Once again, if we're going to work with something, even though it is controlled, we need to always have the context. The context is we have 4 girls here and we have 5 other people we're going to talk about. So these girls they're in recess. What are they doing? Okay, these girls are looking at us. They're posing for a picture. But what about 5 other people? We're going to listen and see what Bruna is doing, what Julia and Chris are doing because they're doing the same thing. We're going to listen to see what Eric is doing and what Carol is doing. and we'll hear this information in a specific order. So this is the teacher's book, by the way. So let's listen and see who is doing what first. So the first thing you're going to do to make this meaningful is to go over the 4 sentences, because the students need to know what these activities refer to. So Eric is listening to music, Bruna is drinking water, Julia and Chris are playing ping pong, Carol is talking with friends. Let's see who is described first. So this is a tiny little challenge, but it's the idea of having that kind of a challenge that is going to be able to give them the confidence that they need so that they will be able to learn and negotiate in the future and describe what the friend that they're thinking about in the game is actually doing. So we're calling on listening here at this moment. We're calling on the skill of listening to be able to understand what's coming along in the communicative activity. Then we need to be sure that they understand the form. So once we have contextualized this very nicely with the listening, we can then focus on the form by showing them an activity which gives them the actual verbs we were using, the actions we were using, and explaining to them how they can practice them. And we want them to write because we know that writing is one way that is going to make sure that the brain is connected to the new information. We have 2 other very, very important assumptions, numbers 5 and 6, which talks about how learning is facilitated. We can use inductive or deductive learning, but we can use inductive or discovery learning in a much better way than if we just give a rule. So if we show evidence, if we show real language in a real context, a communicative methodology says our learners will notice patterns because the brain is constantly looking for patterns. That's why the brain loves storytelling so much. The brain loves to hear about stories and narrations so that we can connect one thing to the other and discover and use the information we have to interpret what's going on in the story. So if we can present language meaningfully and show it to them in a way in which they can discover something, they're going to learn it better. And language learning is a gradual process, but it involves creative use of the language and trial and error. So discovery learning is a good example of how that can be carried out. Let me give you this example. We want our students to be able to describe a picture. We want them to be able to describe a picture of their family, of a scene that they've seen with real people in it. So in order to do that, they're going to need to know how to work with words like drink, eat, jog, listen, play, take a shower, swim, windsurf, and read. If we've already introduced some of that vocabulary in another lesson, which we did when we had the listening part, we've already seen several examples of this. We just haven't seen jog, which is running, and we haven't seen windsurfing or swimming, which are typical of a beach scene. So here we're adding a new challenge and a new layer. But how are we learned about what he does or she's doing? How about talking about ourselves? How is it that we do that? If we use a grammar chart and show them certain things, we can point out, for example, that if we want to talk about something that's going on now, here we're talking about something an action I am performing now, or an action that we are performing now. So now means right this minute. Let's take a look and see what we need. The kinds of questions that we're going to ask to help them notice are questions in which we get them to focus on both the meaning and the form. But if they have the meaning first, if they know that we're talking about an action now and we want to describe this picture, we're going to take a look at what we've got here. So let me ask you a question. you don't have to answer this, but this would be what I would say to the students. Take a look at this sentence, which describes exactly my situation now. Okay, imagine this is my situation at this moment. How many verbs do I need? 2, 3? So they'll say 2. Is one of them a form of the verb be? Yes or no? And they'll tell me. And what do I add to make sure to show you that it's going on now? What is it that I add to show that it's going on now? Whoops, sorry. What is it that I show that shows that it's now? And they will say, oh, you need to add ing. Good, okay. Now I'm going to talk about you and I, because imagine we're both doing the same thing, okay? And so then I show them ask them the same questions, but then I say, now, if I'm studying math, I'm not playing ping pong. Okay, so I'm not playing ping pong. So where do I put the word? What is the word that I use to show that it's not what I'm doing? Okay, the word is not. And where do I put it? And then they tell you where you put it. So, but there are some things we need to pay attention to, and that is have them study so that they can notice the spelling. Do you notice anything about eat and eating? You can ask them. For example, you can say, what do I add to the word eat to show that it's happening now? Okay, ing. But look at jog. There's something that I do here. And then you ask the question, how many G's do you see there? And this then will help them. And how about playing? And what about take? There's something strange that happens here. Do I keep the E? Do I lose it? By asking yes, no questions, I can help them discover lots of things so that ultimately they can practice talking about themselves or talking about other people. So when they get to a beach scene or a picture of their own, where they bring a picture from their holidays, they can say, I'm doing this, and they can say what they're not doing. All of this keeping in mind that we're focusing on what's coming later on, which is the communicative game, which is going to be lots of fun and very meaningful to the learners. When we talk about the last 4 assumptions, this is 7 and 8, and we're going to talk about 9 and 10. A communicative methodology recognizes then that students will develop their own routes to language learning, because it's the brain that learns. It's the individual's brain that does the learning. And that means that because I might be worried or nervous, or because I might be having a really good day and be really involved, my needs and motivations are going to be different on different days amongst different learners. So if that is the case, we need to think about what motivates our learners, which means that basically we really have to know them. If you go to the Cel.Lep Hub and you notice the architecture of the brain and how we talk about how the brain develops, the video there explains how there is a basic architecture in the building blocks of the brain and learning that start as very young children, come into our classrooms, and these are the foundations upon which we can build successful learning. But sometimes we need to know exactly what motivates our learners, and what motivates them is going to be not only their interests, but sometimes their curiosity. Sometimes you find they are extremely curious about something that you were surprised about. So it's important to make that initial connection. When you connect effectively, when you connect emotionally with your learners, you're going to find the root of success for their motivation. So we need to think about, once again, scaffolding these tasks communicatively enough so that our learners can personalize and build on success. Success is the key to communication, and communication is the key to success. The last 2 assumptions then focus on both us and our classrooms. And this is where we're going to take a look at our role. We have a very complex role. We say, oh, I'm a facilitator. But we organize, we give feedback, we create a classroom atmosphere, which is where the affective filter is low, so the knowledge can come into the amygdala and pass from the amygdala to the cortex. We need to think about what's going to help them learn, to scaffold, to provide equal opportunities for the students to use and practice the language and to stop and reflect on what they've discovered. So our role is very complex. I always sort of laugh silently when people say, "Oh, do you still teach? Or do you just teach?" Because that is one of the most complex, teaching is one of the most complex activities on the face of the earth. And the classroom is a community where learners are going to learn best through socialization, collaboration, and sharing. So if I'm up in the front giving a very complex grammatical explanation, they're not going to be really part of that community. I need to think in my preparation. I need to think how I'm going to present new language so that they can collaborate and learn together. This is something we know. So I have a very complex task, which is to think about what it is that is really and truly communicative for them, how I'm going to scaffold it, how I'm going to contextualize it, how I'm going to get them to communicate and collaborate so they can really learn, and make it engaging. So with all of these assumptions, then what kind of a teaching format can I have? Well, a communicative methodology recommends that we basically think about contextualizing new language, presenting it even through a conversation or a short text in which basically the teacher checks the student's comprehension of it and then explains maybe a new structure or some other facet of the new language. If I'm thinking about that original game, remember we said there were at least 5 things I had to think about. But I have to think about vocabulary. I have to think about interpreting questions. I think I have to think about asking questions. I have to think about all of the grammatical structure of, in this case, the present continuous. So I need to think about how I'm going to present that. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. I also have to think about how I'm going to practice it, because it's going to be controlled. I have a careful, I'm going to have some kind of accuracy practice, but it still needs to be accuracy with a focus on future communication. So it's not just rote memory or a fill in the blank exercise. What is that fill in the blank exercise doing to help me towards my communicative goal? And finally, students then need to practice the language, but in different contexts. They can practice in the classroom so that they can practice in another situation, so that you can change the situations in order for them to really develop fluency, because we know that task repetition is the key to fluency. So the more often they practice using the same language in different contexts, the more likely they are going to be to develop fluency. Let's take a look at a little example of this. If I need to think about, let me let this person in. Wait. Okay, just pause this. Let me just see here. Okay, so if I need to think about, I need to look at this and see somehow to engage learners. So I need to ask myself these questions. What's interesting about this picture? Can this be done in English? And what kind of questions can I ask? So the big thing is, what's interesting about this picture is there's a contrast. They're not at school, they're obviously at home. But she's studying and he's not studying. So I need to think about the kinds of pictures that I can actually ask, which will stimulate this kind of thought about the picture. So take a look at the picture I'm going to say. I can ask questions like, is she at home? Is she at school? And what about the boy? Is he at home? Is he at school? And what are the other 2 boys doing in the background? What does it look like they're doing? And what's interesting is that it's a contrast. So I can use this to see. Just let me check something. I'm not sure you're sharing. It says that my sharing has stopped, so let me go back. I can use this to be able to contextualize the new conversation that I'm going to be proposing, the whole communicative activity, which is the input. So her name is Lynn and his name is Diogo. And they're going to be talking about what they're doing and what's different, okay? So listen and find out and read along and see what we know she is studying, but let's see what he is doing. It's difficult to see. Then you play the input conversation, you listen to it as they read along silently while they're listening, and then you can ask him, so is he studying? No. What is he doing? Is he playing a game? Not necessarily. Oh, yes, we're all playing video games, he says. So you get them to think and challenge and engage. So you can very often just start out, rather than just playing the audio, just stimulate with a picture. This is going to engage your learners, and ask yourselves these questions. What's interesting about it? Because this is going to help me contextualize, and communication is contextualized. Can this be done in English? What can I say in English to get them to stimulate their involvement and to show me that they're engaged? And think about the questions. Then the doable task is just basically, is he studying or not? We can see that in the picture, but what is he doing? And this then will build confidence, because the task is easy enough for them to show that they basically understand and that we can move on from there. So the other way we can check is also by using a little exercise afterwards, an activity in which you check to see if he is studying for an English test and who Tim and Dan are and what they're doing. So these are examples of in showing the motivation through success and getting your learners to collaborate with you and each other as they reflect on the communication in which they are about to learn. So presenting is extremely important, and we present the input so that the brain knows, here it comes. Then we need to think about how we can practice in a controlled way. So we can practice in a controlled way when answers can be easily predicted. So, for example, this is a picture of a friend here, okay? And I want to talk about him. I want to know what he's doing. I want to ask him what he's doing. But I can't tell what he's doing. I can't see what he's doing here. I see a football, an American football. I do see something here, but maybe he's playing a game. So I want to check. The way I do that is I ask him now, because it's where he is now, are you watching TV? Okay, and then he can answer, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. So if I want to talk about this picture, I don't know exactly what she's doing. I don't know if that is a friend or a cousin or a sister. So I'm going to ask her about what she's doing. Is she talking with her friend? So I use talk, okay? And the answer is yes, she is. Or if it's not her friend, if it's her cousin, I can say, no, she isn't. She's talking with her cousin, okay? And is he listening? Is he listening to a radio? Is he listening to the radio or to an internet program, a podcast? No, he's not. So you can work with this in a variety of ways just to be sure that they understand the meaning. And then also we can check to see, based on what we were talking about before, we can ask a question and see how we answer it in a controlled way. So if you are not playing a game, you're going to say, no, we're not, we're watching TV. But what about spaghetti? Are you eating spaghetti? No, I'm not. This is what you can expect to hear as a potential answer. I'm eating pizza. And is Layla sleeping? Yes, she is. Shh. What about you? Are you sleeping? No, I'm not. Are you eating spaghetti? No, I'm not. I'm having some water. Are you playing a game? No, I'm not. I'm doing my homework. So you can personalize. So all of these activities are going to be much more practiced if after doing something that you see in the materials that you have are personalized. And you do that by stopping and asking questions and teaching your students little things that they will. This is the unpredictable aspect of language, which we can practice in the classroom in a very controlled way. So we said we can, when we present something, we need to present it in an engaging way through active questioning, through contextualizing. We practice in a controlled way with answers that can be easily predicted, but then you need to extend them because this is an easy activity to perform. It's very basic, it's very simple, but if you personalize it, you're practicing more. And you can show them real pictures as well. This is where having cell phones, if you're allowed to use them in your classroom, is really useful. Then we need to get them ready to have production in different contexts. Okay, so when we are producing in different contexts, what we want to do is we want to see how we can practice talking about what we're doing in fun contexts that are engaging. So one of them is going to be a game-like activity. It gives time for students to be creative, and we could also have them bring their own pictures. We could have we're going to think about the teacher's roles here. So for example, this is an activity that is suggested in a textbook, and it's a game. Students will draw an activity. The group who guesses it right gets a point. And the language that has to be produced is he listening to music? Yes, he is, or no, he isn't. Okay, in this case, he is. But if it were something else, if he were playing soccer, then it would be no, he isn't. So this could be produced in other situations, but let's think a little bit about our role as a teacher. The first thing we're going to have to do is contextualize the production. So this is let's think about a game, okay? And are you good at art? Are you a good drawer? Yes, no, the students. So let's see how well you can convince people, show how well you can represent some of the activities we've been practicing. Then they start thinking. And our role then is contextualizing the whole game. The next role that we have is presenting and eliciting the language that they're going to use. So if I think he's listening to music, what is the question I use to guess? And the students will say, is he listening to music? If I think he's dancing, what is the question that I ask? Is he dancing? Okay. And if I think he's singing, what's the question? Is he singing? And the answer is going to be yes, he is, or no, he isn't. So we need to think about our role as language presenter. And then after we've presented it, we need to be sure that our instructions are clear. So one student is going to draw a particular figure, and the other student who's in line is going to guess. Then you're going to say yes or no. So let's try it. And then I model out. So I show them a picture that I draw, and I'm a horrible drawer. Show them a picture I draw, or show them a picture of me doing something, or some other person doing something, and they guess. But we can also do this with drawing, or we can do this with pictures from our cell phones. So they have a picture of a child who's doing something, and we can guess. This encourages being creative. Give them a minute then. Give them some time to find a picture on their cell phone. Give them a chance to go into breakout rooms to think of really difficult questions or difficult drawings so that they can make it challenging and be creative. Then bring them back, play one round of the game so that you model out clearly so it's for success, and then allow them to actually play the game. So they can play it in the way it's described in the textbook. They can play it by bringing a picture from home. They can bring it by using their pictures that you bring, where you show a picture and you give them some and share them with one group. You share one set of pictures, and with another group you share another set of pictures. There are a million different ways, not a million, but there are lots of different ways in which you can create other contexts for them to practice, so that when you think about communication being real language in meaningful contexts and practice in a variety of contexts, you can guarantee this in your classroom as well. So how do we plan for this? We've talked about communication. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about the implication of the role of the teacher as a facilitator. We've talked about the delicate balance between fluency and accuracy. We've talked about a lot of different aspects. We've talked about the teaching format we can use where we present, where we practice in a controlled way, where we scaffold, and then we produce in a variety of scenarios and put it all together in bigger ones. But how do we plan for that in our day-to-day classroom planning? And I would like to suggest that you think of planning from back to front. If you have a 50-minute class, think about each lesson like a story with a moral to the story, where the climax is at the end. And the big bad wolf ran off into the forest, if you're thinking about a story. Think of the communicative activity as the final high point of the class. And think of how long it's going to take for them to perform that. In this case here, this is going to take a good 10 to 15 minutes just for the students to perform. In the case of the guessing game, where they have to guess and they have to ask and they each have to think, depending on the number of students you have, it could take a good 15 minutes out of your class. So if you think of that as where you want to get, and then plan backwards the timing that you have, you will have a much more effective class. So you also know that when you finish your class, you're going to have a wrap up. You're going to assign homework. You're going to check to see what they can do. You're going to have a little bit of participation. You're going to give them some feedback on their general performance on in the day. So what kind of an agenda am I going to get ready to get to that conclusion of the story? This is when planning from back to front is very useful. So the first thing you're going to do is think of each lesson like a story and start at the conclusion. The conclusion is my speaking task, my big communicative activity. This is what communication is about. This is what I need to have a little writing for, a little vocabulary study for, a little bit of grammar discovery, a little bit of personalization along the way, a little bit of fun, a little bit of this. I need to think of maybe 5 other moments that I need to time in order to get to that great conclusion at the end of the class. So I start at the conclusion. It's 15 minutes plus 4 minutes for 5 minutes for wrapping up the class. I better think about each one of those activities and how much time I'm going to be able to dedicate to each one. And I'm going to then time from back to front, but always thinking about that I need a warm up to get started. I need to get them started. I need to get them engaged, or else real communication at the end will not take place. So that is called planning for success. My warm-up's going to take about 5 minutes, no 10, because they take forever to come in online, so maybe 10 minutes, but it's got to be engaging. How can I get them engaged in thinking about, talking about what their friends are doing if I don't have an effective warm-up? So this is going to be really important to work on. So the big thing is, in a nutshell, you have to know where you start and where you're going. And then you need to agree with your learners. You need to engage with them so that they know, today let's talk about our friends. Let's play a game today in which we have a chance to talk about our friends and what they're doing. Then you need to define the learning format in terms of, is it going to be online? Is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be a combination? What am I going to do? How am I going to engage these people? Am I going to put them in small groups to work on discovering grammar? Am I going to keep them all together with me to discover grammar? The only way I can do that is if I know my learners. So first of all, I need to know them well, their likes and dislikes, so that I can engage them with the right kinds of questions. And then I need to show them the path. I need to show them, I need to scaffold each way, personalizing along the way, so that when they get, as they're walking on the path, as they're doing the scaffolding, building the scaffolding together, we can see that we are getting towards real communication. And I can do that by using some controlled practice, but always communicatively meaningful and success oriented. Finally, at the end, I need to see that learners see what they can do, not what grammar they have learned, but rather how they can use that grammar to talk about their friends. It needs to be, so I need to give them feedback on that. And the way I do that is by giving them relevant and meaningful feedback. So you say, well, always, my feedback is always relevant and meaningful. So ask yourself the questions then. Do you start out by complimenting them on something that they did right? Or do you just say, that was a good job? Because when you give specific message oriented feedback, I liked the way you talked about your activities. I liked the way you talked on the phone with your friend. This was good. When you make specific compliments, you create a greater connection and greater connection to successful motivation for coming back. Then you point out, and the way you point things out is by having them contribute with you on the things that need to be improved. And finally, you show them how to improve that. So when you go home, let's practice this one again. This is a way to improve. This is a way to move forward, so that they always feel successful and share those feelings of success. You share the feelings of success in verbal and nonverbal communication. If you're smiling, if you're encouraging, you can encourage even when you're teaching online by the way you look, by the way you listen to your learners. If you listen carefully to the messages they're giving you, you can recast what they really want to say and help them feel successful. So keeping this in mind, take a look at this picture. You can see that there are lots of different things going on in this picture, lots of different learning scenarios, but there is this general feeling of true engagement. If you look at all of the learners in this picture, they truly look engaged. And that's because learning is ultimately a social activity in which we communicate with each other, in which we exchange messages and information, which we understand the messages that others are saying and sharing, because we learn better together. And this happens when things are organized according to real needs. The implication in the classroom is we have to know what the real needs of our learners are. Our classes need to be learner-centered and learning-centered. We use the materials that we have and adapt them appropriately so that they can help our learners feel the success of real learning. And so that means we have to connect with them. We facilitate by knowing them well, by knowing what they like, what they dislike, by knowing how successful they are at different types of tasks, so we can plan our tasks appropriately and then plan ultimately for success. And planning for success means thinking first of all what's coming at the end and planning from back to front to the warm-up. Then your timing gets better, then your personalization gets more meaningful, and success is more guaranteed. So before we close, I'd like to share some references that I used to prepare this little presentation for you. And this last one is very interesting today to read. It was written in 2006, so it's not exactly today, I think. This is the PDF version that Jack Richards has. And if you'd like, I can make it available to you so that you have a chance to have a copy yourselves to read some of the information on what communicative methodology is about today. But I want to thank you very much for spending this time with me and open up now for questions. If you have any questions, this is also further questions after we look at the chat box. Then what we can do is you can send them to me. It's Cel.Lep, tudo junto, @Cel.Lep.com. Okay? So we have some questions in the chat. Let me see what they are.
We have lots of comments, but not a question specifically. So if you would like to type any questions right now, you can send this in the chat or talk to Nancy further about everything she's shown you today through email. You can write her an email with your questions too, okay?
I'd just like to comment on Gabriela Hilario's comment, which I think is brilliant. She says, I asked my students to teach me, whoops, where are you? Moved away. I asked my students to teach me how to play some games in English, and then I play with them. This is good. When they can teach, you know yourself, you really learn English when you teach it. So this is exactly what your learners can do. If they can teach you to play a game in English, this is really, really good. Okay? Any other questions you'd like to direct? Do you believe in that planning classes backwards applies to all grades, or does it work better with flipped courses? With all grades. With all grades, Paula. It applies best to everyone. Everything we do in life, if you start with where you want to be at the end and backward plan, you will find that you will, as you're teaching, you can adjust things because you know exactly where you're going. We have a tendency to be linear as teachers. We say, okay, I start here and this, and I go this activity, that activity, and around to the next page, and this activity and that activity. And we follow the yellow brick road. But if the yellow brick road leads to Oz, let's see what Oz looks like. Okay, start with Oz and then go backwards on the yellow brick road and see which path you really want to take. Because sometimes you make little changes that are going to make all the difference in the world. And if you really know your students, those changes will make sense. Okay? Any other comments you'd like to make?
Nancy, do you have any specific suggestion for 3-year-olds?
Okay, 3-year-olds learn through play. Okay, and so 3-year-olds, you're not going to have the linguistic input the same way. But when you have 3-year-olds, what you're going to do is think about some general management things that you want. Think about what you ultimately would like them to play with and how you're going to get them to talk about their play. But keep in mind that there is a huge period of time where they have a silent period while they're absorbing language. So sometimes you might find that they're actually playing, but without the language that accompanies with it. So your expectations are smaller, and then all of a sudden they will let it go. So be patient, play, and keep them actively involved in play. And this will, because this is how they learn, is through playing and through trial and error. When you first start out with them, they are very emotional. And sometimes they cry because you're speaking to them in English. But you can show them through your non-verbal language that is accompanied by verbal expression that what you mean is generous and kind, and all they have to do is follow you, and eventually, and you'll wait for them as they come along and play with you. There's an excellent little free course that you can take on teaching young learners, and it's on FutureLearn. I'll put this in the chat. FutureLearn is a site. Okay, let me put this in here. Let me put this in here to everyone. Where is everyone? Okay, it's called FutureLearn. And if you just Google that, you'll find that they have a very nice short course that you can take at your own speed that will introduce you to the importance of play with very young learners, and how you don't need to be afraid to use English to talk to them, and the kinds of communication that you can use to get across better to them.
Do you think like playing a lot of songs and videos with songs and movies. Do you think it would work for them?
I think it's worth it's very much worth it for them to use music because they love to repeat songs and stories, but simple stories. Okay, simple stories, songs, and then if you bring toys and things like Play-Doh for them to play with, you can watch them play with the Play-Doh and gradually introduce language. You can bring a bag of toys and let them play with toys and then introduce language through the toys, through play, because it's very meaningful.
Okay.
Okay. Any other? It would be interesting to have a talk about games in the class. Yes, it would. The role of games. This is really interesting to think about games and how to set them up. You may feel more comfortable about this after you talk to Veruska a little bit later on, after you hear her presentation a little later on. But games are fun. And anything that is fun is extremely, extremely engaging. And this is what we want our students to be, is engaged. But they need to be able to play the game successfully. You know as adults that if you don't get it, you just sort of walk away. Okay, let me see any other comments or questions in the chat. Well, you have my email. It's Cel.Lep@Cel.Lep.com. And if there's anything else that you'd like to ask me about, or any comments that you'd like to make privately to me, feel free to please contact me because I answer. Okay, I answer. And I really thank you for coming here. Somebody said, Gabriela said, I also like to have the same routine every day. Young learners don't seem to like surprises. Is it true? What they like is to know what's coming. So if you say, today we're going to play, then we're going to sing, then we're going to read, then we're going to play, you can show a picture of that. And it's nice. And of course, you always start out with circle time. Let me just mention one small quick thing about circle time and young learners. Circle time is absolutely essential with young learners. It's where you hold hands, it's where you touch. Now, it's hard to have circle time online with 3-year-olds. So you can have little games and routines where you chant certain things, and this will help you, okay? And it's nice to hear that Sandra Oliveira has been working with toys, stories, and drawings with students. Yes, they do love them. It's true, you can't use them and even adults like that. If you can draw, some of you can draw really well, use your drawings to enchant your adults. I, for one, if the teacher comes in and starts drawing, I get instantly engaged. And this is so, so important. Okay? So to those of you who can draw, congratulations. I'm looking at João Victor's picture here. I don't know if he drew it, but it's really interesting. He looks very busy. Okay? So if no one has any other further comments or questions, then I'll invite you to go have a stretch, some water, get a cup of coffee, a piece of fruit, and we'll all join Veruska back at we've got another link, right?
Yeah, it's a different link that you all received, right? Either by Gustavo or Fernanda.
Okay.
In fact, I haven't received.
Who hasn't received? Sorry? Renata, let me see if I can copy here, because as I am in Nancy's Zoom, let me just go back and get mine now. Just a second, and then I'll put it in the chat.
So Paula, just quickly as we're commenting, while some of you are going to stretch and get some water, do you believe that writing the routine on the board to make them feel more comfortable is something that should happen until they're around 9 or 10 years old? Yes, or even older. 12-year-olds appreciate just a brief agenda. Okay, this really helps.
There you go. Now the link is in the chat.
And we talked about, who was it? Medium, you have a surprise box. I always put some object that we have to try to discover in English. They love it. Of course, anything that's fun like that, any kind of surprise. That's why when I showed you that picture, showing the picture before you look at it in the textbook gets them much more engaged than then if you say, look at the picture, see the boy, see the girl, da 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 da. So if you do that separate, so you have to break things down and scaffold pictures as well. And scaffolding using a box is brilliant. Okay? Thanks, Medium, for your contribution. Okay, I guess that's it. Everyone's got the next link. Okay. So enjoy your cup of coffee and we'll say goodbye for now.